Today I will propose some reflections inspired by an ongoing ethnographic investigation among Bosnian Xoraxané Xomá. And I am talking about 200 persons who are often defined by other Roma as Cergaria, tent dwellers, and often in denigrating terms. Many of the Xomá, however, proudly define themselves as such and connect the mobility symbolized by living in tent to both what they call tradition, traditia, and self-determination. In this paper, I will address the question of mobility both in terms of the Xomá's local movements within the Roman peripheries and of the wider transnational trajectories. And I will argue that such mobility challenges the forms of governmentality related to the policing of borders and the production of boundaries of the EU and its member states. The Xomá are originally from Bosnia and migrated to Italy between 1960s and 1990s. And Bosnian identity is still an important feature, but most Xomá reach their hometown mainly through memory and nostalgia, as their former houses are today situated in the Republika Srpska and occupied by Serbs. Note also that the geopolitical and economic assets of post-Dayton Bosnia do not make return an inviting option. And consider also that in the course of many years, the family networks of the Xomá relocated from Bosnia to Western Europe. For decades, the Xomá have been living in shanties, predominantly in the Rome's metropolitan area, lacking documents, legal employment, and often a legal residence. Faced with a precarious life, exposed to weather and lack of basic facilities, and the constant threat of an eviction or harassment by the authorities, the Xomá resolved to mobility and dispersion in the city. By moving and being dispersed, they make themselves very difficult to grasp and anticipate the repressive intervention of the authorities and try giving both the local authorities and population the idea of a light, volatile and ephemeral and thus somehow negligible presence. And dispersion and mobility regard both dwelling and working. Indeed, the Xomá live dispersed and moving between unauthorized encampments on riverbanks and parking lots, occupied flats, shacks or containers in nomad camps situated at the city margins, and city-run structures for disadvantaged persons. And scrap collection and begging, which are important sources of income, are practiced in different places by different persons in order to diminish the pressure on a single territory. And they are not carried out in the district of residence, as the Xomá are well aware that Italians do not like beggars at the doorstep and do not like vans that searching for scraps further congest the local traffic. So mobility and dispersion, therefore, are tactical responses rather than just forced processes. And they allow the Xomá to achieve an individual integration in specific neighborhoods despite anti-Gypsyism and xenophobia pervading both the Italian society and Roman context at grassroots and institutional levels. But mobility and dispersion also respond to a specific horizon of interpersonal relations, wherein each Xomá consider themselves or himself as equal. They do not accept hierarchies or representation from persons outside the family. They do not hide antipathies and harshly react to external interferences in the management of everyday life. Thus, the Xomá move to avoid living with families they dislike or are in conflict with. They may change settlement to curb animosity after a quarrel with a relative or an in-law, or leave a neighborhood to avoid a fight escalating into a blood field. Mobility and dispersion, nota bene, do not make lack of cohesion. Contrary to many Bosnian refugees, whose family ties eventually shattered, the extended families of the Xomá and more generally of Bosnian Romani refugees have maintained a high level of cohesion. And the Xomá tend to live together following the principle of patria viri locality. Thus, we have a combination of segmentation and reconsolidations because related families gather and split according to the moment. And when they are dispersed, they remain constantly in contact with each other. This combination of segmentation and reconsolidation inserts each Xomá family within a wide network supported by linkages of blood and affinity. But these networks is also based on experiences of cohabitation and shared interests and activities. This means that one might find the Xomá living side by side also with other Bosnian and Montenegrin Roma, who are Muslim like us, the Xomá assert. And even with Romanian Roma, who the Xomá apparently despise, but with whom they eventually engage in economic entrepreneurship and friendly relations too. This network stretches out on various Roman neighborhoods, wherein each Xomá family has reference points in familiar dwelling places, which are familiar because known, and because inhabited by relatives and acquaintances. And every family has reference points also in the gage facilities, such as shops, supermarkets, bars, which are usually attended when living or working in the district. Therefore, the Xomá have put strong roots in the Roman peripheries and established a number of meaningful friendly relations with the non-Roma population. And they did this precisely by living mobile and dispersed, that is, by creating an idea of impermanence and transitoriness, which seems to be the key to persuade Italian society to accept the very existence of the Roma. But Rome does not contain all the movements of the Xomá, nor the social networks. As previously discussed, the Xomá talk of familia, in relations to the Patrivili local family, but in a wider meaning, familia refers to every person who shares blood ties with a Xom or Xomni on both the paternal and maternal side. Familia, thus, means a network stretching out on several Italian and European cities, from Rome to Madrid and Tuzla, passing through Lille and Cologne. And these families are what Greek Schiller called transnational ways of belonging, and only partially give way to a transnational way of being. Indeed, family members are bounded by linkages defined in terms of blood, and thus these linkages ideally exist independently from actual experiences of vicinity. But de facto, they must be cultivated in order to gain practical relevance too. And this is why relatives pay visits to each other, even when living in distant lands. Travels are usually on road, by car or caravans, which are slower but provide autonomy for dwelling and cooking. And the Xomá usually travel in small and agile groups of 1-2 nuclear families. Especially when requiring long journeys, these visits may be prolonged for some weeks and thus prove intense experiences of vicinity. Particular events such as New Year's Eve, marriages, or funerals represent good occasions to meet again. But travel serves a variety of simultaneous purposes. Visiting a relative may be combined with exploiting any economic opportunities that translocal and transnational movements may offer, or fleeing from conflict with other Romani families, or getting out of trouble with the law or local authorities. Lastly, travels also provide the chance to explore the opportunities offered by a territory in terms of housing, employment, and access to welfare and documents. Therefore, sporadic travels may mark the beginning of a more assiduous transnational practices. And consider the following case. In 2002, Fikret and Golub, two brothers in their 30s with the prospect of being soon evicted with their families from their camp, went on an exploratory trip to Marseille, where a regularization provision on the matter of immigration was making visa and public housing more accessible than in Rome. These at least were the rumors circulating in the Xomá's network, wherein some families had started going to Spain and France was on the route. In the following years, Fikret moved regularly between Rome and Marseille, firstly alone or with Golub, and later on with part of his nuclear family. After obtaining his legal residence in public housing in a banlieue in Marseille, Fikret became a reference point for the Xomá belonging to his network, the Roma who wanted to try their luck in France. However, Fikret and his nuclear family also maintained a constant presence in Rome, where long periods and even months were spent with Fikret's relatives on the paternal side who encamped in the northern periphery, or with his wife's siblings residing in a legal settlement in the southern periphery. And from 2007, when Rome's Romani population was targeted for several years with extremely harsh policies, Fikret's stays in Rome became shorter and less frequent, and after a series of events, Golub also moved to Marseille with his family. And to my knowledge, the two brothers are now living in Lille, and were recently joined by another brother and their mother. But there is no guarantee that they will remain there definitively. So this case and the discussion is somehow to show that each Xomá person can leave a place knowing that someone will remain there and thus make return possible, and that someone else will mediate with the new territory. And the Xomá potentially dispose of an extremely widespread network stretching out all over Europe and providing social, economic, cultural, and symbolic capitals. The social network continually changes in composition and geographical distribution. Indeed, it is the result of flexible and fluid ties whose relevance in drawing the contours of commonality is continuously renegotiated. And so also the network of familiar places is highly variable. Not also that in the Xomá case, things are complicated by the fact that there is no easily definable homeland to return to. Without entering into the complex debate about the concept of home, I would say that the Xomá left their homeland, so Bosnia, long ago, and they do not fantasize about a return. And moreover, Rome has partially exceeded Bosnia in conveying the idea of homeland in terms of both identity and everyday practices, since many Xomá, especially the younger generations, now consider themselves as Romans, and Rome is still the place around which the existences and movements of many Xomá gravitate. This bifocality, however, is moderated by the idea that, as I once heard from Mahon, we are used to living among the Gagé, I'm quoting, there is no place that is really ours, we are international, and I end the quotes. So there is no place because the Xomá are hardly acknowledged a place by the non-Romani authorities. But there is also no place because the movement characterizing the Xomá at both practical and symbolical levels, they are cergaria, makes everywhere a potentially feasible place to live in. So the pivotal role of Rome comes from my analytical choice and fieldwork. And I believe that it also reflects the perspective of many Xomá I know. Nonetheless, within the larger picture of the Romani network in which the Xomá are embedded, Rome's importance is weakened by the presence of other centers whose relevance depends on the experiences and memories of the place and on the closeness of the persons still dwelling therein. Based on other-centered, fluid and transitory understanding and relations to places, the Xomá's presence shows the characteristic of a rhizome in the Leus and Guattari's meaning of the term, connection between heterogeneous elements, lines of segmentations that make ruptures insignificant, absence of a rigid structure, deterritorialization, and multiple entryways. But how do we frame the Xomá's movement within the question of anti-Gypsyism and governmentality? And I thought the migration and mobility studies may suggest possible leads. Silverstein asserted that people moving across borders are a problem of state policy, national cohesion, racial consciousness, and academic study. And Fassin argues the governmentality of immigration has become a crucial issue of contemporary societies because immigrants embody the articulation of borders and boundaries. Traditionally, borders is used in reference to the delimitation of political entities and their legal subjects, and thus to the exclusion of outsiders, while boundaries instead have to do with the establishment within these borders of identities and symbolic differences that lead to the distinction between members and unacceptable residents. This distinction is merely analytical because borders and boundaries are tightly connected. De Genova argued that the border spectacle showing Europe's outposts threatened by tidal waves of undesirables moves inwards and produces internal boundaries that are constructed and maintained by juridico-political categories such as immigrant, clandestine, illegal alien, that detain a biopolitical character and make migrants vulnerable by subjecting them to the constant threat of deportation and detention. Now, we all know the crucial role that the Roma play in the construction of national identity, and that I think these arguments, and many, there's not only me, I dwarf on the shoulders of giants, as we say in Italy. This argument may be extended to the European level, where the uncertainties regarding debates on the European identity are accompanied by the certainty that the Roma are excluded from it. And thus, we might paraphrase Fassin and argue that the governmentality of the Roma represents a crucial issue in contemporary Europe, especially in case of persons like the Xomá, who are non-EU citizens and thus clearly embody as Gypsy Roma and immigrants the articulation of Europe's external borders and internal boundaries. Now, what about mobility? Studies of borderlands highlight that borders are filters. They allow a certain degree of movement and transgression, which is functional to the neoliberal agenda. The effectiveness of deportation and detention, therefore, lies beyond the number of people actually deported or detained. It is the regime of illegality, deportability, and detainability that functions as biopolitical mean to make migrants vulnerable and exploitable. So, these considerations may lead to disquieting conclusions. First of all, if, as Scott argues, movement is a weapon of the weak, the Xomá's mobility signals the heightening of anti-Gypsyism and xenophobia pervading European societies at institutional and grassroots level. And second, it might be argued that the Xomá might well move, but they would not be able to subtract themselves from the neoliberal governmentality related to the policing of borders and the production of boundaries in the EU. But I have the idea that this last point might be not completely true. The mobility of the Xomá appears a response to biopolitical regimes, but not a passive one. Precisely because of its rhizomatic quality, the Xomá's mobility seems to me a tactical response in the Certeau's meaning of the term tactic. Like tactics, it does not start from a clearly circumscribed space, and it is not fruit of planning, but rather of specific conjunctions. And besides, mobility wallows in the contradictions and ambiguities of the governmentality of immigration and gypsies, making, the Certeau would say, another use of it, functional to the Xomani agenda too. And I beg you to follow my reasoning. The Xomá move across EU's internal borders, knowing that few gypsies crossing the frontier between state members are not symbolically relevant, and except in rare moments, there is no economic or political interest in deporting them. The Xomá also make of the categorization as on the move, undesirable, uncomfortable social waste an advantage to cross borders at the EU, Italian, and also Roman levels. Indeed, authorities gladly hand the waste over to the neighboring country, municipality, or borough. Moreover, the Xomá know that being third national citizens may be an advantage. As Kagler and Melling show, the non-refoulement principle works more when those seeking asylum or temporary suspension of expulsion come from Bosnia rather than Romania or Bulgaria. And state protections and social aids can be temporary. But when the profitability ends, the Xomá simply move somewhere else. The Xomá are also conscious of the fact that one can illegally occupy houses or public soil without incurring in an immediate intervention by the police, that evictions are a display of power rather than a systematic response to Roma's spontaneous settlements, and thus that precisely by moving, the iron fist of repression may be circumvented. In other words, and I come to the conclusion, the Xomá, non-EU citizens, allegedly uprooted and rootless, immigrants, illegals, gypsies, and nomads, have been appearing and disappearing across different Roman boroughs, Italian cities, and EU countries, knowing that their mobility, ideally hindered, but de facto sponsored and sometimes forced, endows their presence with a character of transitoriness that is also the key to permanence in specific territories, as discussed in the case of Rome. A permanence that outrageously stands in the face of its illicit character. So with their presence and persistence, the Xomá challenged the establishment of EU's external borders and its internal boundaries, eventually embodying the realizations of the ideals standing behind the concept of Europe. So that ironically, their mobility or immobility sometimes signals the heightening of what Salazar and Glick-Schiller called the regime of mobility, targeting migrants, and I would say also Roma in the EU. And yet, as a challenge to the governmentality related to the policing of borders and boundaries, it becomes, to paraphrase Isine and Savard, an incontrovertible act of European citizenship. Thank you.